Okay, for this lesson, we're going to go over um, what we call BOC and IBE reasoning. Okay, BOC stands for balance of considerations, and IBE refers to inference to the best explanation. These are two forms of reasoning that we use when we think about things. The different forms of reasoning will use various types of arguments, but I want you to separate in your mind the sort of reasoning about something and the different ways that we can reason about it from an argument itself. And there are different kinds of arguments we use in the reasoning process. Okay, so all right, so let's go through this. Balance of consideration reasoning involves coming to decisions by weighing considerations of pros and cons. This is the balance of considerations. So for example, consider the question, should I get a dog? Okay? Now, when you're trying to decide whether or not to get a dog, there are a number of things to take into account, right? So what you want to do is sort of, and oftentimes this is what we find ourselves doing, is making a list of the pros and the cons, the reasons for and against getting a dog. And then what we have to do is sort of weigh each one and decide whether the pros outweigh the cons or the cons outweigh the pros, and go about coming to a conclusion. Now, balance of consideration reasoning then, should I stay in this relationship? Should I, whatever we want to decide. Anytime you list sort of pros and cons and weigh them against each other, the benefits and the burdens, you end up in balance of considerations reasoning. Now, when we engage in balance of consideration reasoning, we can use either or both deductive or inductive reasoning. So, for example, when you're listing pros for getting a dog and then cons for getting a dog, one of the cons that you might have could be an argument like the following. I shouldn't get a dog because my landlord won't allow it in the house, and you shouldn't get a dog if you can't let it in the house. Now, this itself is a valid deductive argument, and it weighs on the con side, okay, of whether or not you should get a dog, okay? So that's an example of how a deductive argument can occur within a certain form of reasoning, this balance of consideration reasoning. Likewise, we could use an inductive argument. My landlord won't allow a dog in the house because it says in the lease I'm not permitted to have a dog. Here, right, there's another sort of con to getting a dog, that it's not allowed by my lease. Now, we identify this as an inductive argument, and it's because the speaker should intend here that the premises don't guarantee the conclusion, but they make it likely. It's, of course, possible that your landlord would, if you contact your landlord, they would say, oh, yeah, I know it was in the contract, but go ahead if you've been there for a year or you've paid a deposit or something like that. In fact, that happened to me. The very first dog I bought when I lived on my own, we signed a lease that said no pets. And I approached the landlord and said I would like to get a dog. They would live primarily outside. This was in LA, right? So a dog living outside primarily, or at least sleeping outside at night primarily, is not an issue. And the landlord gave us permission gave me, I should say, permission to do that. That's why it's identified as an inductive argument here. But again, there's a deductive and an inductive argument here, both playing roles as on the con side of a balance of considerations reasoning. And the same can be done, obviously we could change the arguments to make them pro rather than con for whether or not you should get a dog. But whenever we're sort of engaged in either inductive or deductive reasoning, we could be engaged in balance of consideration reasoning. And again, that balance of consideration reasoning really just is listing pros and cons. Okay. All right. Now, quickly, we'll just move to the next one. IBE stands for inference to the best explanation. And many of the arguments that we deal with that are inductive in nature are inference to the best explanation arguments. Now, let's be clear here that every inference to the best explanation is inductive. Every inference to the best explanation is inductive. It is not deductive. They are never deductive. So let's go over an example, perhaps, of inference to the best explanation so that you can see what that looks like. Here's an example. Let's say that we have a little garden box in the back of our house where we grow tomatoes and certain herbs, and we have tried to grow strawberries for years, and the sad little plants just never grow. We have like an anti-strawberry garden for some reason. I don't know. I'll try something different next year. But for the last 3 years anyways, strawberries have just not grown in our garden. But anyways, I look out into our garden and there's a hole in the middle, a giant hole in the middle of our garden. Now, looking around at what could plausibly make a hole, I'm going to say that the best explanation is that the dog dug it, that the dog got into the garden and dug a hole, right? Therefore, the hole was probably due to the dog's digging it. So I conclude that the dog is likely the culprit here, right? Likely the guilty party. Why? Because that's the best explanation that I have. Now, give you another example here of this. Why did I bomb the midterm? Not that you did. I'm not saying anybody did. Don't worry about it. You haven't even taken a midterm yet. But let's assume someone asked, why did I bomb the midterm? What we're going to do when we wonder why something failed for us is we're going to try to find the best explanation. And so we're using this IBE reasoning. And so in this case, we might say that the best explanation is that I didn't I didn't starty. I've got to work on my English. I didn't study hard enough. Therefore, bombing the midterm was probably due to my not studying hard enough. In other words, that's the best explanation for what I'm experiencing. Inference to the best explanation always sort of looks at something, it sees a conclusion, it sees something that happened, and it wants to know how that came about and what the cause of that thing is. So a lot of times we're speaking in cause and effect terms when we use inference to the best explanation, obviously, right? Because an explanation really is sort of cause and effect. But whenever we're trying to find an explanation, now I want you to be very careful about this. Whenever we are attempting to find the explanation for some effect or for some result, whenever we're trying to find the cause, okay, we're reasoning in a certain way, and that way is an inductive reasoning of inference to the best explanation. Now, the explanation itself, once we have it, is not actually an argument, and so we're not really reasoning, we're just sort of stating. But when we're trying to determine what the cause is in the cause and effect, then we're reasoning. So separate trying to determine what the cause is, which is a reasoning process, which is an inductive reasoning process, where we engage in inductive arguments. And when we make a causal statement, that causal statement is itself not an argument. There's a big difference between the two. All right. All IBEs, inference to the best explanations, are inductive. They are never deductive. And the reason why, it should be obvious. When you make an inference to the best explanation, you're not guaranteeing that your conclusion is correct. You're aiming for what is most likely the culprit. And in fact, when it comes to our garden, initially we might think that the dog did it. When I investigated our garden, what I found was that in that hole we had about 6 or 7, was it 6 or 7, 5, 6, 7, somewhere around there, baby rabbits in that hole. So some mom rabbit had come and dug that hole, and we had baby bunnies in our garden. So that year we didn't grow strawberries, but we did grow bunnies. That was our contribution. But we are engaged in that case. The reason, or our explanandum could be incorrect. Nonetheless, and so when we assert it, we're making an assertion, something to the effect of this is likely to be true, but it certainly would never guarantee it. So there you go. All right, short little lesson there.